Hello, my name is Maria Mellon, and I'm a senior social work major here at Cal. This project focuses on the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, also known as IDEA. This topic is important to me because as a social work major, I am very passionate about advocating for vulnerable populations, specifically people with disabilities. I want to ensure that they are being treated equal in all parts of their life. Um, Especially when it comes to their education, because we know how important that is. So for this project, I have a visual poster that is being shared on the screen. I also wrote a policy brief, and then I also have a podcast that I am going to play over instead of having me just read what is off the poster.
Today. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about the policy IDEA, which stands for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. But before we get started talking about this policy, I want everyone listening to ask themselves a question. What would a world look like if we weren't required to educate the disabled youth? I know what I'm imagining personally is personal, societal, and economic setbacks, along with an unequal, unjust opportunity for the disabled population. And I say this because without this policy, that world that you're imagining and the world that I'm imagining could possibly be a reality. And before 1975, when this act was passed, this was a reality. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act requires public schools to provide a free, appropriate education and other accommodating services to children ages up to 21 who have a disability that affects their academic progression. But this high-hoped goal of the policy is not always reached due to the costly expenses and lack of funding that this act receives. So today we will be covering the social problem this act addresses, how it addresses the problem within the current policy, how effective it is, and what can be done to better the policy. As I said before, this policy addresses the social problem of appropriately educating the disabled youth. This problem is a huge one to address due to the number of children who have disabilities. 17% of all children in the U.S. are reported to have a disability. That's 1 in every 6 child. So when you put it into perspective, that's a lot. And not providing an adequate education to all these children will create long-term problems, not only for those individuals with the disabilities, but for their peers, community, and society as a whole. Without an appropriate education, these children are less likely to attain a job and become independent. As of 2018, the employment rate of the disabled population was almost 45% lower than the abled population. Just this statistic alone reveals how problematic this social issue is. Along with all of this, providing the disabled population with an education that suits their individual needs supports equality. And in my opinion, that should be a priority not only for the federal policies, but for every individual out there. So now that we have a policy that addresses this social problem, which is IDEA, what approach does it take in order to do so? Well, I'll tell you. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is broken down into 4 sections. The first section basically states that all people with disabilities are recognized as capable and worthy of an education provided to them freely. The second section, or Section B, mandates that schools comply with the 6 key principles of IDEA for children ages 3 to 21. These 6 principles include that every child is entitled to a free, appropriate public education, also known as FAPE. It also includes that when a child is suspected to have a disability that affects their behavior or progress in education, that they are entitled to an evaluation of the suspected disability. So for example, if a child is having difficulties or acting abnormal in a classroom and the teacher suspects something, that they are required to report that, and then further evaluation should be taken to test for the child's suspected disability. The key principles also include that every child between the ages of 3 and 21 that qualify under this act with a disability are entitled to an individualized education plan, which is basically a academic plan that includes their own individual needs, and the parents, the child, the teachers, they come together and make this plan, and it's a mutual agreement amongst all of the staff members for the child to progress academically. The key principles also include that education and services must be provided in an appropriate environment that is least restrictive. So ideally, the child would be in a quote-unquote normal classroom and not secluded or mistreated because of their disability. It also includes that the child and their parent or guardian, their opinions must be taken into consideration in regards to all of this, and that if the child or the parent or the guardian feels that the individualized education plan is not suiting the child, that they have a right to challenge it for it to be revised and improved. Part C mainly covers children below the ages of 3, and it requires that early intervention services are made available to them. And then the last section, Section D, supports the research aspect of supporting the disabled children, meaning, that it requires the Department of Education to create a research plan to improve fundings and technology used by children with disabilities. So everything the policy says it's going to do sounds great, right? At least that's what I thought until I started doing some digging and found out, like I said before, this policy doesn't accomplish everything within it due to the lack of funding. Although this act definitely benefits the disabled population, and it is a huge improvement since 1975 when nothing at all was being done to address this problem, it can 100% be improved. IDEA is supposed to provide 40% of the cost it takes for public schools to provide these children with the services required under IDEA, but it has never even come close to that. In 2018, IDEA provided $13.4 billion, which only amounted to 14.6% of the cost being picked up by the federal government. That's a large gap from the promised 40%. This is a huge issue within the policy that decreases the effectiveness due to the constant increase of children qualifying for services each year under IDEA. The lack of federal funding the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act receives causes schools and local taxes to increase to satisfy the cost of special education programs, staff, and other accommodating factors. Money is also being taken away from staff members and other general programs such as art, music programs, which overall have a negative impact on all students, including students with disabilities. Schools and resources have openly admitted that resources are scarce, and because of this, they are unable to admit adequate services to support disabled children. So this funding is a huge, huge problem. These problems can be fixed, though, by providing the 40% of cost the Act originally promised to begin with through the enactment of the IDEA Full Funding Act. This idea would slowly increase the funding for IDEA over multiple years while abandoning the formula they use now to calculate funds until the full amount is accomplished. In 2017, the IDEA Full Funding Act was introduced by the House of Representatives, but it really hasn't moved since then. Once IDEA is funded to the full 40%, outcomes such as relief from the financial burden on state and local taxpayers, salary raises for teachers and related services personnel, and more support for school districts and increasing graduation rates amongst students with disabilities will be seen. This act has already been proposed and has many advocates in support. In order to fully fund the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, money will have to be pulled from another location due to the high expenses. The IDEA Full Funding Act will be funded by the Saving Lives by Lowering Tobacco Use Act. This will double the tax on cigarettes and other tobacco products, resulting in less tobacco use or no tobacco use at all, while offsetting the cost of fully funding IDEA. So it's a win-win situation. Other possible solutions aside from the IDEA Full Funding Act to promote funding while providing more beneficial education programs is using a more evidence-based formula to calculate funding. When IDEA was first enacted, it was estimated that special education for one disabled child would cost about double of an able child. But today, this outdated formula is still relevant when formulating the funding of IDEA, when we now know that the cost of a special education for one child is roughly closer to 3 times more of an able child. So in conclusion, this act has been a large stepping stone for individuals with disabilities, but improvements can always be made. And for this specific policy, those improvements need to be based on around doing what is already stated within the policy and providing the 40% of funding to states that it already promises. Thank you guys so much for listening to me today, and I hope this Big Idea podcast special has gave you all some ideas of your own regarding the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act.
Okay, so that's my presentation. Thank you guys for watching. Yeah, that's it.